Good evening, everyone. I'm Dr. Paul Wright of Cabrini University. On behalf of Bryn Mawr Film Institute, I want to welcome you to this introduction to our discussion next week of The Battle of Algiers, directed by Gillo Pontecorvo, a film from 1965, not only one of the most important films of the 1960s, but also one of the most important films ever made, frankly. I hope that'll be clear to everyone once we actually discuss it. But for now, I just want to give you some background and food for thought, particularly for those who might be coming to this film for the first time. Before I go any further with the introduction, I did want to extend my gratitude to everyone who has reached out to me in recent weeks. My mother recently passed away after a difficult battle with cancer, and the kind thoughts that have come my way from BMFI staff, but also from students, have been very, very helpful and welcome, and I appreciate it. Looking forward to the discussion with you next week. I want to mention the film's historical context. Obviously, we can't escape it. The Franco-Algerian conflict, which led to the eventual independence of Algeria and its status as no longer a French colony or department, as they used to call it, in 1962. The full extent of the conflict really is from 1954 to 1962, but this film focuses with a kind of laser-like precision on some key years in the struggle, 1954 to 57. And I think that serves the film well, as opposed to trying to capture every last detail of the entire conflict. Scholars and historians have written reams in multiple languages on that conflict, and we're not going to fully understand it anytime soon. But what the Battle of Algiers attempts to do is to capture the urgency of the Algerian independence movement and also the desperation of French forces looking to hold on to Algeria even past a point of all rationality. One of the things that's been said about violence in this film is that it is a form of communication. And this extends beyond the film, right, to thinking about violent political acts as a form of pressure, leverage, and communication. Now, this is not to pretend that these violent acts are without moral consequence or without their own kind of ethical problems. But it is to accept the reality, right, that when people perpetrate violence in the name of a cause, they are attempting to send some kind of message, right, that it is not just revelry in the violence itself, or at least we hope not. Whether the violence is justified is a huge question that this film explores. It asks that question of both the French and the Algerians, in fact. One might say the film's sympathies lie much more with the Algerians' desire for independence, but no one comes out of this conflict or out of this film entirely clean, and I think that's an important thing to remember as you watch it. There's a very famous book about post-colonial movements around the world, particularly in the so-called Third World, not only in Algeria, but Africa at large, the Caribbean, various other parts of the world. And one of the most famous thinkers about the rejection of colonial oppression is Frantz Fanon, who wrote a great book called The Wretched of the Earth. And Jean-Paul Sartre, the famous French philosopher and existentialist, who was very critical of the French presence in Algeria, wrote a preface to Frantz Fanon's very famous book, Wretched of the Earth. And I'm going to read you just an excerpt from what Sartre said. Laying claim to and denying the human condition at the same time, the contradiction is explosive. For that matter, it does explode, you know as well as I do. And we are living at the moment when the match is put to the fuse. Now, what does Sartre mean there? He's alluding to the idea that the West in general, and France in particular, right, has a history of celebrating the rights of man and humanity at large, going back to the French Revolution and things like that. So it lays claim to these values of humanity and dignity. And at the same time, Sartre is saying it betrays those values every time France gets deeper into a colonial empire. And this contradiction, right, between espousing the highest values of humanity and then betraying all those values in the treatment of other people who aren't being given their humanity and their dignity and their rights, is something that Sartre not only opposed, but thought would ultimately destroy France. It was too explosive to contain. Just to read a bit further in what Sartre says here, when the rising birth rate brings wider famine in its wake, when these newcomers have life to fear rather more than death, the torrent of violence sweeps away all barriers. In Algeria and Angola, Europeans are massacred at sight. It is the moment of the boomerang. It is the third phase of violence. It comes back on us. It strikes us. And we do not realize any more than we did the other times that it's we that have launched the boomerang. And that metaphor is a beautiful way of encapsulating what Sartre saw as the fundamental problem of French empire, right? That it talked a good game about human rights and dignity, right? Certainly after 1789, but abroad was perpetrating what was an indefensible oppression of other human beings. And Sartre thought that this would inevitably have a reaction, a boomerang effect, and that eventually all these oppressed peoples, not only in Algeria, but all over the world, would eventually assert their own rights and bring a terrible cost to their oppressors. So that's an important metaphor I want you to keep in mind as you watch or rewatch the Battle of Algiers. I will say a bit about some of the actors in it and characters in it a little bit later. But what I would stress to you first and foremost is that this film really is unique in having what one critic has called a choral, choral protagonist. So kind of like a Greek chorus. And what that means, simply put, is that this is a film without any one individual hero or protagonist. This is about two peoples pitted against one another, two peoples desperate enough to do violence to one another, and no one being willing to bend, and everyone being the tragic victim of that unwillingness to bend. And the film's portrayal of French domination of Algeria, what Sartre was so critical of, really caused a lot of problems for the film in various countries, particularly in France, not surprising. It's often thought that the film was outright censored. Not exactly the case. It de facto was censored. In other words, French theaters, exhibitors would not show the film because they feared the backlash if they dared to show it. So throughout the 60s and into the 1970s, you couldn't watch the Battle of Algiers in France. Again, it wasn't an official state form of censorship necessarily, but it was de facto censorship, backed by fear of violence from the pro-empire, anti-Algerian independence, right-wing paramilitaries of France, the people who eventually soured on Charles de Gaulle because he wasn't tough enough on the Algerian question, the people who tried to have him killed, which was famously dramatized in another film, right, The Day of the Jackal. So this kind of right-wing paramilitary violence was something theater owners were understandably afraid of, so they didn't want to take any chances by exhibiting the film. So that's one reason you couldn't see it for a long time. It was also not always celebrated by those on the left. Some thought that the film's portrayal of the French military commander, I'll talk a bit more about him later, Jean Martin, is the actor who plays him, Colonel Mathieu in the film. Some thought that the portrayal of him as a man of sophistication and kind of elegance and even cool was too generous and too friendly. So there were folks on the left who had some issues with the film, and certainly folks on the right, who thought that the film was propaganda for communism, propaganda for Algerian independence and anti-colonialism. The style of the film, which I hope you'll notice in watching it or rewatching it, is a pseudo-documentary style. It's a film that isn't a documentary but likes to feel like one. And the curious thing is that when the film was released in the United States in the 60s, the first U.S. print of the film had at the start a kind of announcement, and it said, "Not even 1 foot of newsreel or documentary film is included in this picture." In other words, this looks like documentary footage, but it isn't. This is a crafted film. It's a film that wanted to announce itself as a crafted film, while at the same time claiming a certain kind of realism, a certain kind of truth-telling. And in fact, Pontecorvo himself has talked about his approach to history and his approach to politics in the film as the dictatorship of truth. And for him, it didn't need to be a documentary to be honest, and it didn't need to be news footage to be real. And I think there's this interesting blend of material that feels raw and found with highly crafted, very aesthetically calibrated footage that threads a needle, right, between the kind of realism we assume or hope for from a news report as opposed to a highly stylized Hollywood film. And this is definitely not a highly stylized Hollywood film. It's definitely much more on the side of documentary, if you will. But it is not a documentary, and it doesn't want to be. Some of the techniques used to create the look and feel of the film include black and white stock occasionally used, natural light, telephoto lenses and handheld cameras to give it a kind of guerrilla style. A lot of this clearly influenced by one of Pontecorvo's inspirations, Roberto Rossellini. Those who know Rome, Open City, or any of the Italian neorealist films that Rossellini pioneered will see the influences there on Pontecorvo. There's definitely an aesthetic that is consistent from the post-war work of Rossellini all the way to what Pontecorvo is doing in the 1960s. A couple of other things here I want you to think about. One would be to know a little about Pontecorvo himself, his background. He was from Pisa, from an Italian Jewish family, always felt a bit of the outsider, joined the Communist Party when he was young, eventually became disillusioned with it because of what happened in Hungary in 1956, but never gave up entirely on Marxism, right? He was disenchanted with sort of Stalinist totalitarian style communism, but was always enchanted by left-wing politics. And for him, that was as natural as, breathing the air. It was just something that he, as an Italian Jew, felt very drawn to. It. So it certainly affects the way he portrays the struggle in Algeria. He also was a leader of the Italian resistance in Milan and elsewhere during World War II. So like a lot of Italian communists, his experience of that war was very brutal and firsthand and not in an organized military, right? He was fighting against the organized powers of Mussolini and then later the Germans. So a really interesting character who never apologized for his political passions. To pretend that this film is neutral in its take on the conflict in Algeria would be really off. It is not intending to be neutral. It's unapologetic about not being neutral. As I said earlier, though, it is a film that does consider the cost on all sides, though. What becomes of people, the degree to which they have to dehumanize their enemy to win, and the degree to which they run the risk of dehumanizing themselves in the process of fighting the enemy. So from that standpoint of the transformative and often dangerous effects of violence, I do think the film is trying to be a little bit even-handed. And there are certain scenes in the film we can talk about where that is evident. But in terms of the overall political struggle, Pontecorvo's sympathies are clearly with the Algerian independence movement. A few other things to think about here. Ennio Morricone, who is everywhere in the best of Italian cinema in the 20th century, and a lot of other countries' cinemas. We have evidence of his contributions to American film as well. Morricone does the unforgettable score for this film. It is deservingly iconic. Ennio Morricone recently passed away. Very depressing for every one of us who's a huge fan of film music. You're going to hear in watching Battle of Algiers one of Morricone's best scores ever, without question. And then finally, I want to say a bit about the actors you're going to see. There are a lot of them. So as I said earlier, there's a choral protagonist in the film, which means there's not any one protagonist. But there are two actors I want to point out because they point out the interesting contradictions at work in the making of this film. One of the actors is Sadi Youssef, who is Algerian and actually had been part of the Algerian independence movement and resistance. Once Algeria became independent, he became a senator and a major political figure. He's still alive, quite old, but still alive. And it was his original treatment for a film adaptation of the conflict that Pontecorvo was drawn to. And he got credited as being a kind of producer on the project, but always felt in later years that Pontecorvo had kind of understated Youssef's contributions to the generation of the film. The screenplay credit goes to Pontecorvo, the director, and also to Franco Solinas. But Youssef really doesn't, from his point of view, get the credit he deserves. He plays basically himself in the movie. He plays the head of an intelligence ring of revolutionaries who are fighting against the French. It's exactly what he did in real life before the independence was achieved and he became a politician. So this is an example of some real life stunt casting, right? You're going for a person who actually lived through all this. Fascinating character. Youssef originally apparently wanted Paul Newman to somehow be in the film. Maybe Youssef was having kind of Hollywood dreams of what this film would look like. Pontecorvo wanted to go in a very, very different direction, which I think is good. The other actor, just for the contrast that I want you to think about here, I mentioned earlier, his name is Jean Martin. He plays Colonel Mathieu, who wears these unforgettable kind of aviator shades, kind of like the shades of the guard in Cool Hand Luke, a movie many of you may know. And I think the look of that guard in Cool Hand Luke may well have been directly influenced by what's going on here. At any rate, Mathieu is a fictionalized version of many French generals who tried to keep the Algerians down. The most famous one is a man named Massou, a French paratrooper who was initially very pro-de Gaulle and eventually very anti-de Gaulle when de Gaulle didn't do what he thought was necessary to win in Algeria. And it was Massou's cadre of right-wing paramilitaries who eventually turned on de Gaulle and wanted to reinstate French Empire at all costs. So Jean Martin plays this Colonel Massou character in the film, who is tasked with finally bringing a successful resolution to the conflict and keeping Algeria in the French Empire. Again, a term I might have mentioned earlier, they didn't really call it a colony, they called it a department, as if it were part of so-called metropolitan France. So Algeria was being terminologically treated as part of France, and many French people living there saw it as part of France and had grown up there, had been born there. But in reality, it is a colonial situation. And when this French colonel is brought in to end the conflict, he resorts to torture and all sorts of questionable methods in order to achieve his aims. And the film's message is ultimately that only ensures that the independence has to happen eventually, right? You cross a line with people, and there is no more convincing them that they are benefited by staying with France. The actor Jean Martin, who plays Colonel Mathieu, he was a very kind of left-leaning actor who had done a lot of Beckett and who was very sympathetic to Sartre's opposition to what was going on in Algeria. And Martin actually signed a kind of declaration of opposition to the continued French presence in Algeria and abroad elsewhere. And Sartre was one of the signatories to that document. Jean Martin was as well. So it's kind of ironic to have someone who was so deeply opposed to the conflict actually participating in it in the film version, right, as the French oppressor. And then finally, just we'll leave you with one more quote from Frantz Fanon's Wretched of the Earth, this time from Fanon himself. It's just a beautiful passage, and I think it really sums up what this film is about. Fanon says, "We must leave our dreams and abandon our old beliefs and friendships of the time before life began. Let us waste no time in sterile litanies and nauseating mimicry. Leave this Europe where they are never done talking of man, with a capital M, yet murder men, with a small m, everywhere they find them, at the corner of every one of their own streets, in all the corners of the globe. For centuries they have stifled almost the whole of humanity in the name of a so-called spiritual experience. Look at them today swaying between atomic and spiritual disintegration. So let us not pay tribute to Europe by creating states, institutions, and societies which draw their inspiration from Europe. Humanity is waiting for something other from us than such an imitation, which would be almost an obscene caricature." This goes even further than Sartre's irony in the statement about the boomerang, right? Sartre is saying that the French, in celebrating man, in celebrating human dignity and rights from the Revolution on, were being hypocrites, right? Because they talked a good game about that, but they didn't practice it abroad and often didn't practice it at home. But Fanon himself here is saying that we need a better model even than that for the post-colonial world and for the world at large, that we need something that transcends the pettiness and the limitations of states. However otherwise desirable they may be to us, however otherwise necessary they may be to us, there has to be a better way of honoring human dignity than a situation that results inevitably in one state oppressing another, or a state oppressing a people and denying them the right to even have a state. And Fanon basically is asking here that we think outside the box of traditional nation states. And until we do that, he says, we're never going to stop being hypocrites, right, who talk about man in such glowing terms and yet are murdering men and women and children everywhere. So I hope these themes and thoughts help you think about the film. I look forward to talking to all of you about it. Thank you so much.